Hi, everybody, and welcome back to yet another cracking edition of the Matt Brown Show. This is the Secrets of Influence series, where we are talking to business leaders all about the power of influence and what they do to grow their influence and really leave the world and their markets in a better place. And with me in the hot seat today is the man, the legend, Lee Zohlman. He is the founder and managing director of Universal Multisport. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Matt. Really great when I got your invite and checked out everything that you're doing and talking about influence, because it's funny how things come around. I've been thinking a lot about this in the last couple of months with a big project I'm working on, thinking about that word influence and what it means, and where I've lived with influence, either being influenced or trying to influence others. So it's perfect timing that you reached out, and so happy to be on.
Thanks, buddy. Well, it's interesting. Why are you thinking about influence? You don't have to reveal the type, what the deal. If you want to, it's great for context for the audience and that. But why are you personally thinking about influence? Why does it matter to you?
Well, I mean, the big part of it is I run this sports consultancy globally. So we represent various companies around the world in the business of sports, and we advise them, either do regular business advisory work, we do corporate sponsorship, or we do business development work and investor relations. And when you're doing business development or sales or investor relations, there's always a sense of influence. You're trying to influence somebody to do something that you want them to do. So that's only one part of influence, but that's where it's coming into my world, is always trying to influence somebody. And that's not a negative. It's just the way that it is. I have to steer them to create an action, influence them to take an action of what I want. So just in the last couple of months, like I was saying, that word of influence has just become more and more in the front of my head. And I've just been thinking about more about it. Like, Universal Multisport, one of the buckets that we do, investor relations, is we find investors for some very unique companies that are starting up, and there's obviously a large part of influence there. We have to influence them to get a meeting. How do we do that? We have to influence them to want to research the deck a little bit more, to get another meeting, and then obviously to make an investment.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been podcasting for pretty much 10 years now, and I never really quite landed on influence until this year, which is quite a weird thing. Wrote all these books, sold out all these shows, just and built a huge network around the world of the who's who of business sort of thing. And I never quite thought of it as influence until I moved to the US, and I was trying to think about, what my next entrepreneurial play was going to be. And I was like, well, what am I actually doing? Why is this working?
Yeah.
And I used the story in my book, Secrets of Influence, where when I moved to the States, I think I sent you a copy, but I'll send you a print copy if you'd like. But anyway, so I moved to the States and I sent 1,000 emails to startups who had raised $1 million or more. And I went to bed that night, woke up the next morning, I had 190 booked interviews. And then that's when I went, holy shit, this is actually influence. And so, I always keep saying to people, I was always doing the right thing in the wrong country. And now being here, it's like, fuck. Now it's like, well, and I talked to executives. I spoke to John Carlson. He's the CEO of Mark Taylor. And he said to me, like, what do you do? And I'm like, we help business leaders influence their markets and so on. And he's like, fuck, keep talking, just what you were saying. I've been talking to my team about influence, consistently. And I haven't found someone who can actually specialize in this space and help us to do things in a different way.
Right.
And so it's refreshing to hear that this is happening. But I'd like to double click on what it actually means to you. How would you define it? You touched on some of the sort of use cases of influence, if you like, procuring a deal, getting a meeting, this kind of stuff, and. If you were to put a sentence on it or define this is what influence is, what is that?
Wow, you mentioned at the front of this podcast the hot seat, so I guess you really do put me in the hot seat, right? If I had to define influence, it would be positioning and strategy to obtain a result that I'd like, an outcome that I'd like. I think that would be, in a 2-second thought process about it. That's what I've come up with. If you give
Okay.
me till tomorrow, I can come up with something a lot better, I promise.
Well, if you read my book, there's a literal definition in there. But you said it was positioning, strategy, and
Yeah, positioning and strategy to obtain an outcome that I'd like.
yeah, understood. Yeah, I agree. And I asked that question not to put you in the hot seat, so to speak, but just because people don't actually understand how to define it, and if you can't define it, you
Sure.
can't use it. Do you see what I mean?
Sure.
I think, and also what I'm trying to do with the series and with the book and the agency and that is, I want to take business leaders and turn them into business influencers. And so the starting point is, well, what is influence? Why do you need it?
Right.
And so that's why I asked the question. What's interesting for me is that if you ask 10 CEOs, you'll find that they say 10 different things. Do you see what I mean? And it's
Sure.
because I believe anyway that influence is very intangible unless you can put it into context for a specific application. So, for example,
Right.
what you were saying around how do you procure like that massive IndyCar deal I was reading on your website this morning that you did, that for me wouldn't have manifested if you weren't able to influence those people to give you what you wanted, but also in a way that was ethically responsible, meaning it was mutually
Of course.
beneficial for that deal to take place.
Of course. Of course. And, influence, I think, can have a negative connotation, especially in this day and age. But I don't see it as a negative connotation. It is a very broad term. So it can cover a lot of different areas. But obviously, with the word, with just the phrase of influencer, influencers are can have a very positive connotation. If you have a brand and you've built your brand by using influencers, great. If you're successful in making money and expanding your product line, and you've done that just by using influencers, then it's a positive, wonderful thing. If you're influencing somebody to do something that maybe they wouldn't have done that is a little morally suspect, then it's a negative connotation. So I really think it's the context that it's used in this
Mm.
day and age. But if we talk about influence in my world, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to influence somebody to get a meeting. I'm trying to influence the CMO to get a meeting so I can present to him this opportunity or this investor this opportunity. So I think so much of what I do is influence, and I've been an influencer in the past. So I think I run the gamut if we were to look at that whole world.
Mm. So tell me, how do you grow or cultivate your influence? Like, what activities are you, doing in the market to position yourself with strategy, and like you were saying, with positioning, maybe with
Yeah.
content? Are you speaking? Are you an author? Are you like walk us through how are you through in the digital ecosystem, if you'd like, expanding your influence in the context of trying to reach CMOs, as an example?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my industry space, I do some speaking engagements. And for instance, I did a speaking engagement in Monaco last month. So then that's actually cross promoted through my LinkedIn and through different companies' LinkedIn. And that helps to expand my profile. I do thought leadership pieces on my websites, and then I will promote those as well. I try to be active on LinkedIn. I find it really professional. I like to keep Instagram to more of a personal thing. But in my world, in the spaces that I'm working in, LinkedIn is really the best bet versus I don't do anything on Facebook at all.
Mm.
Um, and then I am obviously a guest on podcasts here and there, so I do that part. And I think that those would be the three main ways I expose myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I love that. So, funny enough, I was in Monaco not too long ago. Beautiful place. I was a captain on super yachts at the time,
Oh,
um,
amazing!
but I think it's as a place for speaking. It's an
Yeah,
incredible place for speaking specifically. I've
yeah,
attended quite a few like destination masterminds in Monaco over the
yeah.
years.
Oh,
And I
wow.
just feel like people, when they're in that place, it's really interesting, this
Yeah,
idea of environment, right? It's very different, like to Miami and Monaco. They're kind of the same, you would say, in
yeah,
some sense. But Monaco, from an environment perspective, it seems to attract bigger influencers, or you know what I mean, like more.
Sure.
Have you found that too?
Absolutely. For some reason, it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Well, it's not even a country; it's its own municipality inside of France. So I think just because of the extreme wealth there, and because of the way they have their political system set up and their financial system set up, it does attract that, and it's one of the few places on Earth that can attract those types of individuals. So it's a very special place for business. It's a special place to do to host meetings and conferences. I've been there many, many times. I have my client is based over there that I was there speaking with. So yeah, I think it's a very unique place for business.
So, Lee, when you're speaking on stage at Monaco at a conference, as an example, what do you speak about, and who are you trying to influence? What's your message or your story?
I have no idea what I was saying. I have no idea. No, this was a very specific niche business conference, and it was on global sports media rights. So this is a conference that I was speaking at that has all the buyers of sports media rights and the sellers. And I was speaking on a panel. I was actually moderating this panel, and we were talking about digital evolutions in streaming. So how people are getting their sports right now. What are the different technologies and evolutions within that? Not very exciting to most people, but if you like sports media rights like I do, if you like sports and you really like to understand the players and companies behind streaming and broadcasting and how that all works, that's what it was about.
Okay. Well, let's go back. Let's turn left and go to thought leadership. What is your thought leadership approach? I mean, how do you decide, for you personally, being an expert in, sports rights, sponsorships, and being on the front end of what's actually happening, live streaming, and how everything's being disrupted, and so on and so forth. When you think about that context, right? People want to know. I mean, I'm not in the space necessarily, but I'm curious because I do live streaming and I'm in content, and sponsorships are in fact quite centered to what I do. But I'm curious for you to unpack for us in that context. How do you approach thought leadership?
I try. It's interesting because I think the first thing is you can't please everybody in thought leadership, because when you put yourself out there as a leader in anything, I think back to when I was 17 years old and I worked for an esteemed attorney. I was an assistant in an attorney office my senior of high school, and he was a very esteemed attorney in our state of Florida. And I read a negative article about him in the Daily Business Review, which was a law newspaper every morning. Anyways, a negative article, and I said to him, "Hey, I read that article about you." And he looked at me and he says, "A tall tree gathers much wind." And I've remembered that over the years, and that goes into my thinking about when you put yourself out there as a leader. And I've put myself out there as a leader, as an instructor, as a high level instructor in different spaces, industry spaces for my career. And you can't please everybody, and you're always going to have the negative naysayers, but then you're also going to have your followers. So you have to be prepared for that, right? If you're going to put yourself out there as a thought leader, you have to be prepared for that. I think Jocko Willink is an amazing thought leader, right? He's probably one of the foremost guys in this thought leadership space, but even he is going to get negativity in his world, right? So I think when you think about that, you have to be ready for that. I don't try to force stuff down people's throats, and I try to give them a very analytical, numbers-driven piece of information if I can, because I think numbers don't lie. So if you're using numbers, then you can't really go anywhere with it. So I tend to do that through my blog posts and through my LinkedIn posts, and that also can be cross-promoting others as well. So to instigate some other people's reactions and thoughts. So that's a little bit on my piece there.
Yeah, you're touching on something that for me is really essential in this whole conversation about influence, because I think there's a lot of people who see themselves as thought leaders, but all they're actually doing is giving their opinion. And so thought leadership and even influence is really about shifting perceptions and inspiring actions and driving decision making at scale. You cannot drive someone's decision or shift a perception if you don't have evidence. So that thing that you said, I call it like value added content. So if you look at all the content that's currently thought leadership content on LinkedIn, much of it actually isn't video. It's actually written content.
Yeah.
And nothing spreads faster than the written word, which is why I'm such a big believer in books and repurposing and content models and stuff like this. But the idea is, if you have a perception, let's just say that you're not the right media sponsorship partner or sports partner for a particular brand like Renault, how do you shift that perception? You can't just go, well, yeah, we are in fact the best partner for you. It's like, well, I don't care. How do you make me believe that you are in fact the right partner? And you have to have evidence. Well, actually, we signed this massive, 10-figure IndyCar sports merchandising deal with, NASCAR. That's why.
Right.
You have to actually have evidence. And then I think when you're able to unpack that evidence and package it in a way that's strategically thought through, and that's delivered in a non-obvious fashion, that's how you get attention. And I think too many people are in this, well, I think this, or whatever it is. Podcasting is bad. Podcasting is dead. Or, no one will read a book. It's like, well, what evidence do you have? Because I know that 2 million books are self-published every single year, just in the US. You know what I mean? So I think what you're saying is really important for people to understand, is like, you actually have to have evidence. You must have evidence to go, if you're going to be seen as a thought leader.
100%. I mean, like I said, you have to include the numbers, and it helps to make a case. It helps to tell the story. And we do the same thing when we're putting together sponsorship deals. Sponsorship deals now are more complex. They require more strategy. They require more time than ever before. 20 years ago, it was a lot easier because we weren't able to have so many metrics. Now we're able to measure everything, and the brands want to know everything. So they want to see the metrics back, and they know it's available. So it takes time to put all of that together, and it takes time to build all the layers and to tell the story. So you talk about influence, you go back to influence and using numbers, metrics to help influence whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. So I think we're talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Lee, who's been the most influential person in your business career, and why?
I won't mention any names, but I'll say there are 4 of them. 2 I'll mention, 2 I won't mention. I'll make it very succinct. One is my executive coach, Ilana Golan. So she's definitely been influential. She's with Leap Academy. That's number 1. Her approach, what she's built, and how she coaches her executives, I found extremely helpful. Second is the CMO of a race car team that I worked for many years, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. And he was just I thought about him this morning. I have a deal pending. And some of his words rang true in my head. And I just remember him saying to me, sometimes you just got to send a contract. So he was CMO for one of the race car teams. And he really taught me a lot. I had one early mentor early in my sponsorship days. And he was a kind of this gregarious fellow. And he taught me something also very valuable, which is don't ever go into a meeting without knowing where someone went to school. And it wasn't just specifically that, and that is true, and I still do that to this day. But it's also know about them, do your background, do your research before you go into a meeting. So those are 3, and 4. I will say, going back, is Jocko's book, Extreme Ownership, that I read when it first came out, which was like 17, 18, and the Dichotomy of Leadership, his follow-up book, and looking at all of the lessons that he's learned and now that he's giving to others. Those have been a tremendous help on my journey.
Yeah. Leif Babin, the co-author, was on this show, interestingly, and it's actually a good point of departure to talk about the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is about leadership. Because oftentimes I think this whole idea of influence is really about leadership in whichever way. If you're thinking about the business context, or maybe even at home, right? If you have kids, I don't know if you have kids or whatever,
I do.
but I've got two kids. I think a lot about the things that I say as a father, the leader of the home, so to
Of course.
speak, and then also, as I say, I think about leadership a lot in the business world. And I'm curious for you to give me your view on the link between influence and leadership, and what have you learned about effective leadership in the context of influence? So whether that's growing people, or or maybe even in a negative sense, maybe there was an experience you had personally that you felt you were like, fuck this is horrible, and this wasn't the right way to do leadership. What have you experienced there?
Yeah, I think with leadership, I think a lot of it boils down to giving them the why, making sure they understand the why, and not just giving them a directive, but making sure they understand the why. And that's going to make them a better employee. That's going to make them be able to make smarter decisions in the future. I think that being an effective leader also comes down to having empathy for the individual. So I like to believe, empathetic with my employees. And what else on leadership? I think clear communication is very essential, and also making sure at the end of every conversation that I make sure that they read back to me whatever it is, whatever task they need to do. So I always try to have them do a read back, and then we go over it together. Um, and then, if something doesn't happen, if they don't do something well, essentially it's my fault. I probably didn't explain it to them well enough. I just hired somebody new last week, so I just went through all of this with them and giving them the way that I like to have things done, the culture of how we operate here. So that's definitely in the forethought of my head. Um, Leadership, like Jocko says, it's probably the hardest thing that there is to do in the company. It really is. And I've been fortunate to have some really great people working for me, and hopefully it continues.
Mm. Yeah, Leif said to me, he said to me, I asked him about that. I said, what makes, because I was basically saying, when you get on the ground, like you get deployed, he said to me, we don't actually have a plan. So we have like the loose idea of what's going on, but we don't really have, like, we don't have a 23-step plan
Right.
as a Navy SEAL team to get on the ground and go, hammer these guys or whatever.
Yeah.
So I said, well, then what do you do? So he goes, well, when we get on the ground, the first thing that we do is we go to the head of military operations, and we say to him or her, probably him, but we say to them, what do you need? What do you need? And because things change on the ground while you're up
Right.
in the air,
Right.
whatever. And then he might say, well, we've got some insurgent snipers up on that hill, and we need them taken out. And he's like, cool, we're going to go take them out. So in other words, what he was saying is that leadership, effective leadership, is really about service. Figuring out what people need and providing a service to them in a way that creates value. And that for me
100%.
is that's really what influence is, because I think I've said it before, but I think influence is not about elevating oneself, it's about elevating others up. And influencer marketing, like you touched on earlier, Lee, like that for me is elevating oneself. If
Yeah.
you pay me to promote your product, and I'm just taking your money because I have 1 million followers on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever, that for me is not influence. That's shit. But if you're looking to really elevate other people up through service as a business leader, that for me is what real influence means.
Gotcha. And well, first of all, Leif is a legend. I mean, this is a real underachiever. He got into both West Point. I think he got into West Point and the U.S. Naval Academy, and had to choose one over the other, and went to the Navy. Those are two of the hardest schools to get into in the U.S. And then became obviously who he became. So a lot of props to him. And I think effective leadership also comes down to asking a lot of questions, and letting your employees come up with the answers and the directives. Let them come up with the plan, and see how they can do implementing their own plan. So I think a lot of it is helping to coach them up as well, and that'll help them evolve. That'll help your company evolve. Another great mentor of mine said, I said, what do you attribute to your success? He says, I hire good people and I pay them well. And I think that was a really great eye opener for me, and something I've taken into account many times.
It's great advice. A couple of good sound bites there on this show. So let's wrap this up. Lee, what's your advice if there was a business leader, an entrepreneur, a CEO listening to us have a yarn about influence today? What advice would you give them about growing their influence or scaling their influence as a business leader?
You have to be hungry for your business. And you have to understand that if it's your business, no one's going to care about it as much as you do. And if you're not hungry for it, then it's not going to succeed. When I started my first company in 1998, I did not stop working. I mean, people say that, but I literally worked every day because there was stuff to do every day. I was up early over coffee, over emails, and I worked every day. I mean, I took pseudo vacations. I was married at the time. She was always saying, you're on your phone. Even though she was my business partner, she could separate it a lot better than I could. But I was working every day. I was thinking, I was strategizing, I was planning, I was on emails, I was on phone calls 7 days a week for years and years and years and years. And that's how we built success. So I would tell them that you have to be passionate about what you're doing, and you have to be ready to do a lot of hard work when you don't want to do hard work. And too many people, especially here in the US, they're just lazy and they just want people to do the work for them. And that just grates on me so bad, because I know what goes into building a company. So, I think that those would be the sound bites I can give you on that.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, just to add, my mentor, as I did this when I was in South Africa a while back. People who've been following the show will know, but I did this series called Secrets of Scale, and it was a live podcast, live audience, all this kind of stuff. And we did, I think, 3 versions of the event with 4 panelists or whatever, and they'd all kind of scaled their businesses. And one of the questions that I asked was, well, if you were to hang your hat on one thing that enables a business to scale, because many don't, and it's okay
Right.
if you don't scale it, right? Like if you were like a solopreneur and you've got a small team doing $1 million a year and you're good, that's fine, then that's great for you. But if you're interested in scaling the thing and you're taking on investor capital, all this kind of stuff, what do you hang your hat on? And I kept asking that question. You know what they said? The answer was the same more often than not. Came down to what you said, Lee, which was about hunger. The guys that build really big businesses, the guys that become true influencers, the guys that put a real dent in the universe, those are the guys that just stay hungry. And it's interesting because you said to me before we went live, you said to me, oh, congrats on all your success. And I was like, I don't feel like I'm successful.
Yeah.
And because this idea of hunger, you have to keep being hungry for that next thing. And so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Lee. That does conclude your time in the hot seat. Everybody else, if you haven't yet, check out the book Secrets of Influence on Amazon, and we'll see you all again soon. Ciao for now.
Thanks, Matt.